I'm here with the esteemed composer Reiko Futing, who has agreed to talk to us about his latest recording. Welcome to Classical Conversations, first of all.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
I should say welcome back because we've spoken before, and a lot of the music on this disc is kind of an extension of what was heard on that first disc that you did. You've done a few since then. But
That
I wonder if you can start by talking about there are a lot of different pieces on here, and they all have very interesting titles. And I wonder if you can start with the first piece, which I won't even try to say the title. How would you say it?
passage time copy.
Okay, well, that's simple. Can you talk a little bit about the piece? And you wrote it for Miranda Cuxon, the violinist. It kind of sounds like a 10-minute cadenza, you know. I wonder if any of that had, entered your compositional process.
In a sense, yes, because I know Miranda very well and I've known her playing for many, many years. And from my experience, she is one of the most fantastic violinists, musicians, but also artists that I've ever encountered. And I wanted to write a piece that's also interesting to play in terms of the actions which are involved. So everything is very fast, but it's clearly structured, whether it's the right hand that moves fast or the left hand that moves fast, or both of them move fast. So it's as much based on the idea of sound as it is on the idea of actions. But you're right, it's basically a continuum of very fast sounds from the beginning to the end. So it could really be considered to be a cadenza.
Yeah. Well, it's an interesting entry way to your entire album. Lots of different pieces on here for different performers, a string quartet, also a chamber ensemble, and et cetera, et cetera. You even have spoken word in the last track. I wonder if you can, let's skip to the end and you can talk a little bit about that last track because it includes the largest amount of musicians and it also includes identifiable quotations that you use to create this music. I wonder if you can talk about the creation of that piece. The von der Stadt is the name
Mhm.
of it, right? Which means from the city or from the state, something
The
like
city.
that. Yeah,
Yeah.
from the city.
Mhm.
And I wonder if you can talk about the aesthetic that goes into that and also talk about these great performers.
There's a fantastic piece of art that I've discovered once at the Museum of Modern Art in San Francisco by Robert Rauschenberg, which is called Erased de Kooning. And what he basically did is he asked for a pencil sketch by de Kooning to erase it. And it's displayed. And what's so fascinating is that you can actually still see at least traces of the original pencil drawing. So it's an act that on the surface attempts to get rid of something, but it reveals that certain things simply will always be around and will always stay. So what I did in this piece is something quite similar. I took a chorale from the early 17th century and I erased a lot of its music. So all we hear is an occasional fragment. And I also erased the original text, but you still hear some fragments of the original text, which are then spoken. I used then the other words in the text and translated them into instrumental sounds. So as if the ensemble becomes a chorus that fills in whatever gaps have been created. And eventually the gaps that exist in the music are being filled by different kinds of sound. So it's a similar process, but I take an origin, I erase parts, only leave some fragments, but I fill these spaces that I create with something else.
It's so fascinating, your process, and thank you for giving us a glimpse into that. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about your aesthetic, your style. I mean, it says here that you aim to explore the psychological nature of memory through the compositional device of musical quotation. What do you mean by that?
So one of the most influential composers and thinkers and artists for me is Helmut Lachenmann. And I have a collection of his writings, which is called Music as an Existential Experience. And he talks about the idea of what it means to have an experience that's existential quite a bit in his writings and also in his lectures and interviews. And I've been thinking about this quite a bit. And it's not only a general approach to what art means in the context of society, but also what it means to be human. And to me personally, the most existential experience that we can have is the experience of time. It is also tied to our awareness of time and also the awareness of our time that we have. So time typically is then divided into the past, the present, and the future. And personally, I find the past most interesting because I don't think that the present is a possible experience because it constantly transforms into a past. And as we experience every day, we don't know what the future may or may not hold anyway. So it's not a category that I can really work with. But that led me to being interested in working with music of the past. The idea of a quotation is basically the idea of a memory, but it also means the idea of a transformation, a recontextualization, a kind of upgrade, a redefinition, etc., etc.
You sound like a philosopher more than a composer almost with what you're saying. I mean, does this idea come to you and you create the music, you decide what you're going to do with it, where it goes? What's your process in deciding, like, for instance, in that last piece, what to erase, from the music? How do
That's a
you
very good
decide?
question. Yeah, that's a very good question. So sometimes I approach the piece from an analytical perspective. And here I erased all the parts that don't share three notes in the melody. So I only kept three notes in the melody, and then only used these very specific parts. But it could also be different ideas. The last piece is an interesting piece to me in that context of this CD because it was written also for a specific location, and that's the city of Magdeburg, which is about an hour and a half west of Berlin. And
Mhm.
it got entirely destroyed 99% in the 30-year war between 1618 and 1648. So erasing something is also a kind of destruction. And I wanted to write a piece that memorializes what happened in the city because the scars, interestingly enough, they can still be noticed and experienced. So the background of the piece that I'm writing for the specific occasion sometimes also generates specific techniques.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I notice, and I wonder if this is by design. You start with smaller forces on the album, and then it grows as it goes on. You add a couple of players, right? You first have a violin, then you have violin and piano, then violin and piano and whatever instrument, and then you expand it to a string quartet, and then you have a full-blown ensemble there
Yeah,
working its
that's
way.
that's
Yeah.
maybe because of my analytical mind, but it's an additive process. The violin that's mentioned in the title of the CD is most exposed in the first piece, but it's least exposed in the last one. So it kind of transforms into becoming a member of a group.
So there's a lot to uncover here and to study, but folks can just sit back and listen to the whole thing from beginning to end, like I have done, and you pick up little things here and there, but you don't really know what's going on underneath. So it's really interesting, these stories behind the music. I wonder if you can talk about some of the other work on the disc, like I mentioned, the violin and piano. Um, Maybe the movement for two. I'm reading off of here. I'm not quite sure how you say this. VE is in parentheses for two, choreophony, Schattenspiegeltanz, a mirror dance. I mean, how would you translate that? Schattenspiegeltanz.
A shadow or a mirror dance. Yeah, that's
Ah,
exactly kind
okay,
of
so I was pretty close. My German is not as rusty as I thought.
exactly.
Can you talk about that piece and the performers, Dory Na and Jin Yang?
Mhm. So the piece, so I like to play with words and letters as much as I like to play with sound. So you can actually read, at least that was my intention, the first word as either being moment or movement. So it was a piece written to be choreographed by a small ballet company here in New York City called the New Chamber Ballet. It's run by a good friend of mine, Miro Magloire, who originally also studied composition with Maurizio Kagel in Cologne in Germany, but then came to New York, became a dancer, and is now a choreographer. So the idea is that there would be a piece of music for two players, and there would be two dancers that would then dance to that kind of music. And I had the idea of the movements that the dancers do being mirrored or shadowed in the performers and the other way around. The choreography at the end ended up being a little different, but that's also what's really beautiful because Miro then projected his own creative ideas onto that idea. The performers, Dori plays with the new chamber ballet. One interesting and I think actually quite fascinating aspect of the choreographies is that there's always live music, so it's never performed from recording. And the pianist on the recording is Jing Yang, who went to the Manhattan School of Music and is a pianist that I work with also quite a bit.
Yeah. Can we talk about the Beethoven tribute that you've got here? This free whereof, wherefore that you wrote in 2020. What is the relationship to Beethoven with that?
There are very short quotations from his Opus 1 Piano Trio number 3 in C minor. It's the slow movement. The piece was written actually for a Beethoven celebration in 2020, which then could not really happen as planned because of COVID at this point. But I liked referencing that piece because based on what I wrote, Beethoven came to Vienna to primarily study with Mozart, who unfortunately then passed away too early. So he picked his quote unquote second choice and took lessons with Joseph Haydn for lots of reasons, of course, to learn, but also to simply get access into the artistic and musical worlds and circles in Vienna at this point. But the last of those three piano trios, Haydn did not approve and recommended for Beethoven not to publish it. But Beethoven, who was famously stubborn, felt this is exactly the one that should be published. And they had an argument about this. But the notion that a student argues with their teacher is actually also a very interesting one because I think it was a moment of emancipation for Beethoven that he had found something that was really his. And I guess Haydn recognized it, and that's why he recommended Beethoven not to publish it. But yeah, that's the piece. There's only very small snippets that if you don't know the piece, I think you would not recognize, but you might recognize that there is a somewhat different musical language also involved that pops up every once in a while.
Yeah, I tried to hear the Beethoven in there, and it's going to take a little more work, so I'll get back to you on that. Because the quotations are so short and small, and I'm not familiar with the Beethoven piece. I wonder if we can finish by talking about the string quartet that you have here. Those driven out will come. It's a chorale. Can you mention what that is about?
So the quotation is also a Beethoven piece, and that's the slow movement of the A minor quartet called Heiliger Dankgesang, which is an extensive piece. Beethoven says it's in Lydian, which some people would disagree with, but it seems to be somewhat autobiographical that Beethoven had overcome some kind of illness, and he was writing this piece also in reference to that. But to me, it's one of the most special pieces of music that I've ever encountered. And it is really written by someone who had, at this point, enough distance to the world and to life to write art that's so sublime and pure, but still very much alive at the same point, which is a rare balance to create. So I referenced that chorale in the piece. There's also other influences, and some of them are literal, so not only musical. But that's basically where the title comes from, because the opening of that movement by Beethoven is like a chorale.
Yeah. Well, that last piece also has the skipping to the last piece, which we keep coming back to. It has spoken dialogue in it. Yeah. Yeah.
Yes, there are like all the musicians in the last piece, they say words every once in a while, and that's also true for the piano trio.
Uh,
And these quotations, they are from Beethoven, but also from a Czech philosopher whom I discovered a few years ago. His name is Willem Flusser, and he was born, I think, in the 20s of the 20th century in Prague, but because of his Jewish background, had to leave his home and lived most of his life in Brazil. And he did a lot of work on the idea of migration because he himself was a migrant. And it's something that's utterly fascinating to me to read his philosophical perspective of what it actually means to relocate or to dislocate. And yeah, these quotations are also every once in a while spoken in the trio.
Yeah, it kind of scared me a little bit when I first heard it because I wasn't sure. It kind of sneaks its way in. That I assume is by design.
Hmm.
Well, Reiko Futing, thanks so much for talking to us. This album has all kinds of different sounds on it. I really want to dig into it more. I want to thank you for making time for us here on Classical Conversations.
I would like to thank you. It's always really good to talk to you, Brad. Thank you so much.